I moved into the apartment in late October, desperate for a fresh start after a messy breakup. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit in an older complex on the edge of downtown. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the place smelled faintly of old wood and something stale, but it was mine. After years of living with roommates, I was relieved to have my own space, even if the rent was suspiciously cheap. The landlord, a quiet older man named Mr. Holloway, barely asked me any questions before handing over the keys. "Previous tenant left in a hurry," he mentioned offhandedly. "Place has been empty for a few months." I didn't think much of it. People break leases all the time. At first everything seemed normal, but small things started to bother me. The doors wouldn't stay closed, no matter how carefully I shut them. I'd come home from work to find the bathroom door slightly open, when I was sure I had left it closed. The closet door in my bedroom would be cracked just an inch, enough to make me second-guess myself. At night I'd hear faint creaks, like the sound of wood shifting coming from the closet. It was an old building, so I chalked it up to settling noises. Still, it left me uneasy. I told myself I was just paranoid, shaken from moving into a new place alone for the first time. Then, things got stranger. The bathroom light flickered randomly, but only when I was inside. At first I assumed it was faulty wiring, until it started happening when I was mid-shower, flickering just once, like a deliberate blink. One night I woke up sweating, convinced I had heard my bedroom door creak open. When I turned on the light, it was still shut. The next morning I found my fridge door slightly ajar. I blamed myself for being careless, even though I was sure I had closed it. But then food started disappearing. A slice of pizza gone. A yogurt missing. A half-empty milk carton that was suddenly just empty. I lived alone. There was no one else. By the time a full week had passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd be brushing my teeth and feel eyes on me from the hallway. I'd sit on my couch at night, scrolling on my phone, and swear I saw movement in my peripheral vision. It was subtle, just a shadow shifting near the closet door, but enough to send chills down my spine. I told my best friend Rachel about it, and she laughed it off. "You're psyching yourself out," she said. "It's just the new place nerves." Maybe she was right, but I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that something wasn't right. I decided to set up a motion camera in the living room. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cheap one I found online that recorded short clips whenever it detected movement. I figured if someone was breaking in, this would catch them. Maybe it was my landlord checking on the place without telling me, or, God forbid, someone had a spare key. The thought made my skin crawl, but I needed answers. That night I made sure everything was locked, double-checked the fridge door, and went to bed feeling a little foolish but more at ease. At around 3 a.m. I woke up with a jolt. There was no sound, no clear reason, just a deep, gut-wrenching sense that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded as I stared at my bedroom door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Just silence. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I reached for my phone before even getting out of bed. I had a new motion alert. My stomach twisted as I opened the video, expecting to see a flickering light or maybe a bug crawling across the lens. What I saw made my blood turn ice cold. The footage showed my living room, dimly lit by the streetlights outside. At first there was nothing. Just my couch, my coffee table, the doorway to my bedroom. Then, movement. The attic hatch above my closet slowly, almost imperceptibly, slid open. A pale hand gripped the edge, followed by a face, half hidden by darkness but unmistakably human. The figure hesitated for a moment as if listening, then silently lowered itself down, moving with an eerie, practiced ease. I watched, paralyzed, as the person, whoever they were, stood in my living room, head tilted slightly, staring toward my bedroom door. They didn't move for a long time, just stood there, watching. Then, just as soundlessly, they climbed back up and disappeared into the attic. The hatch closed behind them as if nothing had ever happened. I dropped my phone. My body was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. Someone had been in my apartment, not breaking in, not sneaking through a window, living there, hiding above me, watching me sleep. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move as my brain screamed at me to do something, anything. I needed to get out, call the police, get help. But for a few minutes, all I could do was sit there, gripping my phone, replaying the video over and over as if the footage would somehow change. It didn't. That thing, no, that person, had been there the whole time, watching, waiting, living just a few feet above me without me ever realizing. I forced myself to move, slowly sliding out of bed and grabbing my keys with trembling hands. My legs felt weak as I tiptoed toward the door, terrified that if I made too much noise, I'd hear that attic hatch creak open again. I didn't even stop to grab shoes. I just unlocked the door as quietly as possible and bolted. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands shook so badly that I struggled to unlock my car, but once I was inside, I locked the doors and called 911. My voice was barely steady enough to explain what had happened. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes. I watched from the safety of my car as 2 officers entered my apartment, one of them reaching up to pull down the attic hatch. They climbed up, flashlights in hand, disappearing into the dark space above my closet. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard it, shuffling, a loud thud, and then yelling. My stomach twisted as I saw them dragging someone down. It was a man, gaunt, filthy, wearing clothes so old and tattered they barely looked like fabric anymore. His face was hollow, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, and his eyes, God, his eyes, looked inhuman in the harsh glow of the police flashlights. He didn't scream, didn't fight. He just let them take him, staring at me the whole time with a strange, unreadable expression. The police found a small makeshift space in the attic, a pile of old blankets, empty food wrappers, and a notebook filled with scribbled writing that made no sense. He had been there for months, maybe longer. They told me he must have been sneaking down at night, taking just enough food to survive, watching me. They didn't know how he got in. There were no obvious entry points. Maybe the previous tenant left the hatch unlocked, one officer suggested, but that didn't explain why the landlord hadn't checked or why no one noticed him before. I stayed at a motel that night, unable to even think about stepping back into that apartment. The next morning, I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't care about losing my deposit. I just wanted out. He didn't argue, didn't even sound surprised. "I understand," was all he said. It made me wonder if he knew something, if maybe this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I moved out that same day. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares. I see that attic hatch creaking open in the dark, feel the weight of unseen eyes on me as I sleep. Sometimes I wake up convinced I hear footsteps above me, even though I live in a new place now, on the top floor of a building with no attic. I check my closet doors obsessively, make sure my fridge is closed tight, and double-check my locks every night. But no matter how careful I am, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, he's still watching. I moved into the house on a Thursday. It wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom rental on a quiet street, but it felt like a fresh start. After the divorce, I needed something stable for me and my daughter, Ellie. She was only 5, still young enough to think of this as an adventure rather than the fallout of a broken marriage. I was grateful for that. The house was old but clean, with a big backyard and a sturdy wooden fence. It felt safe. That first night, I let Ellie pick out her new bedroom, and we ate pizza on the floor, laughing at how empty everything felt before the movers arrived. I remember thinking, this could be good for us. Saturday morning, I was unpacking boxes when there was a knock at the door. It was a man, maybe in his late 40s, with thinning gray hair and sun-weathered skin. He had this odd, expectant smile, like he was waiting for something. "Hey there," he said, peering past me into the house. "You just moved in?" I nodded, instinctively blocking the doorway a little. "Yeah, just a couple days ago." He nodded back but didn't introduce himself. Instead, he squinted at me like he was sizing me up. "So, you live alone?" His tone was casual, but the question made my skin crawl. "Just me and my daughter," I said before realizing I probably shouldn't have mentioned Ellie. He perked up. "Oh yeah? You work from home or you commute?" My gut told me not to answer, so I kept it vague. "Bit of both." He looked up at the porch. "You got security cameras?" That was when I decided the conversation was over. "Listen, I gotta get back to unpacking," I said, stepping back. "Have a good one." I shut the door before he could say anything else. That night, I couldn't shake the conversation. Maybe he was just nosy. Maybe he was one of those neighborhood busybodies who made it their job to know everyone's business. But something about his questions felt off. Too specific. Too deliberate. I made sure all the doors were locked before heading to bed. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. 3 slow knocks. I sat up, heart hammering. The knocks came again. I crept to the front window and peeked through the blinds. The porch light cast a dim glow, but I could still see him. The same man standing at my door, just staring. He didn't knock again. He just stood there, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a little odd. Maybe he'd had too much to drink the night before. I tried to put it out of my mind. But later that afternoon, as Ellie played in the backyard, I caught movement near the fence. A figure stood just beyond the property line, half hidden by the trees. Him. I was sure of it. He wasn't moving, just watching. I marched outside, pulse pounding. "Can I help you?" I called out. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house before putting Ellie to bed. I tried to act normal around her, but my nerves were shot. Every little noise made me jump. I kept telling myself that maybe I was being paranoid, that he was just some weird neighbor, but my gut wouldn't let it go. I sat in the living room with the TV on, just for background noise, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I dozed off. I woke up to a sharp sound, a click, like a doorknob turning. My heart stopped. I sat up, ears straining. The house was dead silent. I reached for my phone and checked the time, 2:13 a.m. Slowly I got up and moved toward the hallway. Every step felt impossibly loud in the quiet. When I reached the back door, I felt the blood drain from my face. The deadbolt was locked, but the handle was turned all the way down, like someone had tried to open it. I stood there for a long time, barely breathing. Then, from behind me, Ellie's small voice whispered, "Daddy, someone's looking in my window." I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. Ellie was standing in the dim hallway, clutching her stuffed bunny, eyes wide with fear. My stomach twisted into a knot. I rushed into her room, my pulse hammering. I expected to see nothing, to tell myself it was just a shadow, just her imagination. But as I reached the window, I saw it. Movement. A shape pulling back into the darkness. My hands shook as I yanked the blinds down. My mind raced. I needed to call the police, but what would I even say? That a man knocked on my door and asked weird questions? That I thought I saw someone outside? I grabbed Ellie and carried her to my room, locking the door behind us. I sat awake for the rest of the night, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind against the house. When the first light of morning crept through the blinds, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I went outside, half expecting to find nothing, to convince myself that I'd imagined it all in my exhausted, anxious state. But there, in the dirt beneath Ellie's window, were footprints. Deep ones. Someone had stood there for a long time, watching. I didn't waste any time. I called the police that morning, and an officer showed up about an hour later. His name was Officer Reynolds, a guy in his late 50s with tired eyes and a slow, deliberate way of talking that made it hard to tell if he was taking me seriously. He listened as I explained everything: the man at the door, the strange questions, the knocks in the middle of the night, the footprints beneath Ellie's window. When I was done, he let out a small sigh and rubbed his chin. "So he didn't actually do anything illegal?" he said, more to himself than to me. I clenched my jaw. "He tried to get into my house," I snapped. "That's illegal." The officer nodded slowly. "Yeah, but you said the door was still locked, right? He didn't break in. And you think it was the same guy outside your daughter's window, but you didn't actually see his face." I stared at him in disbelief. "So what, I just wait until he does break in?" Reynolds raised a hand, placating. "Look, I get it. It's creepy as hell. But unless he trespasses again or makes a direct threat, there's not much we can do. Best I can offer is an extra patrol in the area." He handed me a card. "Call if anything else happens." That was it. That was all they could do. I stood there on my porch, gripping that useless card, watching the officer drive away. A sick, helpless feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that this man had been watching us, or the fact that no one was going to stop him. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the doors and windows, double-checking the locks, even pushing furniture in front of the back door. I didn't care if it was paranoid. I wasn't taking chances. That night, I let Ellie sleep in my bed. She didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. I just wanted her close. I kept the bedside lamp on, listening to the house settle, my body tense under the blankets. At some point, exhaustion won. My eyes closed, the room blurred, and then, bang, bang, bang! A violent pounding at the front door. I shot up, heart in my throat. Ellie stirred beside me but didn't wake. The knocking came again, harder this time. I reached for my phone with shaking hands. 2:47 a.m. Before I could dial 911, I heard it. Something much, much worse than knocking. The sound of the doorknob turning. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, gripping my phone, listening to the metal rattle as the knob twisted back and forth. Slow, deliberate. Like whoever was outside knew I was awake. Knew I was listening. My mouth was dry, my body locked in place. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I forced myself to move, slipping out of bed as quietly as possible. I didn't want to wake Ellie. My legs felt weak as I crept down the hall, my phone clutched tight in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to stay in the room, but I had to see. I had to know if he was still there. I reached the front window and, as carefully as I could, pulled the curtain back just an inch. He was there, standing completely still on my porch, not knocking, not trying the door, just standing. His face was partially in shadow, but I could see his mouth, curled into a grin. He knew I was watching. And then, as if that was enough for him, he turned and walked off into the night. I called the police again. This time they sent 2 officers. They took my statement, checked the locks, walked the perimeter of the house. but by then the man was long gone. "No sign of forced entry," one of them said. "Might just be a drifter looking for an easy target." Easy target. That phrase stuck with me. I wasn't some helpless victim. I wasn't going to let this continue. The next morning, I installed security cameras, front porch, backyard, windows. I made sure the system was connected to my phone so I'd get alerts for any movement. I also called my landlord and demanded they reinforce the locks. The fear hadn't left me, but at least now I felt prepared. The cameras helped. I didn't see him again, not for weeks. And just when I started to think maybe he was gone for good, my phone buzzed in the middle of the night. A motion alert. My heart pounded as I opened the app. The camera feed loaded, grainy in the darkness but clear enough. There he was, standing just outside the frame, at the edge of the yard, watching the house, watching me. And then, just like before, he turned and walked away. I never saw him again after that, but I still wonder if he's out there, if he's watching someone else now, if he's waiting for the next easy target. When I moved to the city, I was desperate for a cheap place to stay. I had landed a new job, my first real shot at getting my life together, but money was tight. After scrolling through endless listings, I found an apartment that seemed too good to be true, small but fully furnished, utilities included, and way under my budget. The only catch? The landlord gave me a weird vibe. His name was Mr. Langley, an older guy, maybe in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and an awkward smile that never reached his eyes. He barely made eye contact when I signed the lease and handed me the keys with an oddly firm grip, saying, "Everything's in working order. Just don't change the locks." I laughed it off, thinking it was some standard landlord rule. That first night, I fell asleep feeling relieved. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. The first week went by without incident. The apartment was old, sure, with creaky wooden floors and a faint, musty smell in the kitchen, but I didn't mind. I was exhausted from long shifts at work, so I spent most of my evenings eating frozen dinners and passing out in front of the TV. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my front door unlocked. I swore I had locked it the night before. I always double-checked, a habit I picked up from living in not-so-great neighborhoods. But I convinced myself I must have been careless, maybe too tired to remember turning the deadbolt. Still, it nagged at me for the rest of the day. A few nights later, something else happened. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a noise, so soft at first that I thought I imagined it. A slow, deliberate creak. My brain struggled to place it, my body frozen in that weird in-between state of sleep and wakefulness. Then it hit me. My bedroom door was opening. The air in the room felt different, heavier. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, and reached for the lamp on my nightstand. The second I turned it on, the room was empty. The door was open just an inch more than I'd left it. But I was alone. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease. I installed a deadbolt on my front door, despite the landlord's weird warning. Then I bought one of those cheap doorbell cameras online. I figured it would ease my paranoia, make me feel in control again. That night, I set up the camera, checked that it was working, and went to bed, hoping for the first good night's sleep in days. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to my phone vibrating on my nightstand. A motion alert. Groggy and disoriented, I grabbed my phone and opened the app. The footage made my blood run cold. The camera showed a grainy black and white image of the front door. At first, I didn't see anything. Then movement. Someone stepping into the frame. My stomach dropped. It was Mr. Langley. He was standing right at my door, dressed in a long-sleeved button-up and slacks, like he had just come from some late-night errand. His posture was weird, rigid, almost hesitant, like he was debating something. Then slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. I watched, frozen, as he inserted it into the lock and turned it. But the deadbolt I had installed stopped him. He jiggled the key a few times, his face barely visible in the dim porch light. Then, suddenly, he stepped back. His head tilted slightly, and he looked straight at the camera. I don't know if he could actually see it in the darkness, but something made him stop. After a few seconds, he turned and walked away, disappearing out of frame like he had never been there at all. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat in bed, watching the video over and over, trying to make sense of it. He had a key that should have only been mine. How many times had he let himself in before I noticed? Had he been inside while I was asleep? The thought made my skin crawl. As soon as the sun came up, I called the police. They came by that morning, but their response was underwhelming at best. No crime had technically been committed. They said he was my landlord and that, legally, he might still have access to the unit. When I showed them the footage, they just shrugged. "You could break the lease," one of the officers said. "That's probably your best option." I didn't have the money to move out, not yet. But I wasn't about to stay there unprotected. I went to a hardware store that afternoon and bought a second deadbolt, one I knew he didn't have a copy of. Then I replaced the one I had already installed just in case. I also wedged a chair under the doorknob at night, an old trick my grandmother used to do. I told myself it was enough, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my body tense. Every creak of the old building sent a spike of adrenaline through me. But nothing happened. No footsteps outside my door. No motion alerts from the camera. Still, I didn't feel safe. The next morning, I decided I was done playing defense. I wanted to confront him. I walked down to Mr. Langley's unit on the first floor and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. I could hear movement inside, but he never came to the door. I should have let it go. I should have packed my things and gotten out while I still could. But I needed answers. That night I checked the camera again. He hadn't tried the door since the first time, but something else was off. The footage from the previous night, the one where he tried to use the key, was gone. At first I thought it was some glitch, but as I scrolled through the timeline, I saw that multiple recordings were missing. Someone had accessed my account. Someone had deleted the evidence. I slept with a knife under my pillow that night, every muscle in my body wound tight with fear. But nothing happened. The next morning, I called my job and told them I was sick. Then I packed everything I could fit into my car and left. I didn't care about the lease. I didn't care about losing my deposit. I just needed to get out. 2 days later, I got a notification from the doorbell camera. The battery was running low. My stomach clenched as I opened the app, half expecting to see Mr. Langley staring directly into the lens. But the feed was blank. No porch light, no sidewalk, no apartment door. Just darkness. He had taken the camera. I never went back. I don't know what he was planning, what he wanted, or how long he had been coming in before I noticed. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with that sickening feeling, the one I had the night my bedroom door creaked open. And I wonder, if I hadn't installed the deadbolt, if I hadn't put up the camera, what would have happened? When my wife, Emily, and I moved into our new home, we were excited to finally have a place to call our own. It was a quiet neighborhood, mostly older houses with big oak trees lining the streets, the kind of place where people still waved at each other from their porches. We had barely started unpacking when our next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, knocked on our door. She was tiny, with deep wrinkles and watery blue eyes that never seemed to blink enough. She introduced herself politely but got straight to the point. "Make sure you close your blinds at night," she said, her voice thin but firm. Some things shouldn't be seen." We laughed it off, assuming she was just a quirky old lady, the kind every neighborhood has. The first few nights in the house were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar creaks of an old house settling, or maybe it was the way the streetlights barely reached our backyard, leaving long, shifting shadows against the trees. Emily didn't seem bothered. She loved the house, loved the big windows in our bedroom that let in the soft glow of the moon. She always forgot to close the blinds, and I didn't see the harm in leaving them open. The neighborhood was safe, and our backyard was fenced in. What was the worst that could happen? Then, one night, I woke up feeling observed. The kind of sensation that prickles at your skin, that makes your breath hitch in your throat before you even know why. It was just after 3 a.m. The room was bathed in that eerie blue darkness that only happens in the dead of night. My eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when I saw it. Someone standing in our backyard, completely still, facing our window. I froze. The figure was tall, unmoving, its face hidden in the shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears as I shook Emily awake, whispering her name. She groggily sat up, squinting into the darkness. And then, as if it had been waiting for us to notice, the figure stepped back, slowly disappearing into the trees. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it had been some kind of trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by a tree branch swaying in the wind. But Emily saw it too. And when I checked the backyard, there were faint footprints in the damp soil, leading from the edge of the fence right up to where the figure had stood. A deep, sick feeling settled in my stomach. We had a security camera facing the backyard. We hadn't set it up yet, but I decided that was the first thing I was going to do that morning. Something told me this wasn't just some random trespasser. By the afternoon, I had the security camera up and running. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic motion-activated camera that sent alerts to my phone. I went about my day trying to push the incident from my mind. Maybe it had just been a fluke, a drunk passerby who wandered too far, a neighbor's late-night guest taking a shortcut through the yards. But as night fell, that uneasy feeling crept back in. This time, I made sure to close the blinds before bed, and Emily didn't argue. I told myself it was just to be cautious, to ease my nerves, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I woke up again. 2:57 a.m. My body felt tense before my mind even registered why. I reached for my phone, heart pounding as I checked the security app. There it was. The camera had picked up movement in the backyard. I hesitated before opening the footage, my hands slightly unsteady. And then I saw it. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot as the night before, facing our bedroom window. It didn't move. It didn't shift its weight. It just stood there, staring. A cold dread settled over me. I nudged Emily awake, my voice barely above a whisper as I showed her the screen. She covered her mouth, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell?" she breathed. I wanted to go outside, to shout, to do something, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I rewound the footage. My breath hitched when I saw that the figure hadn't just appeared that night. It had been there the night before, and the night before that. My stomach churned as I kept scrolling back through the footage. Every single night for the past week, the figure had stood there for hours, completely still, watching. The next morning, we went straight to Mrs. Holloway. She didn't seem surprised when I told her what we had seen. Instead, she sighed, as if she had been expecting this. "You left your blinds open, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, too unsettled to deny it. She shook her head, her expression unreadable. "It always starts that way," she murmured. "It watches, waiting to be noticed." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, it?" Emily asked, her voice unsteady. Mrs. Holloway looked at us, eyes sharp despite her age. "Close your blinds, every night. And whatever you do, never open the door if you hear it knock." That night, we followed Mrs. Holloway's advice to the letter. As soon as the sun went down, we locked every door, closed every blind, and double-checked the camera feed before going to bed. But even with the windows covered, I still felt it. That same suffocating awareness, like something unseen was pressing against the house, waiting. I barely slept, jolting awake at every small noise. At 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected in the backyard. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The footage loaded, and there it was. The figure. But this time, it was closer. Standing right at the edge of our porch. I could see its outline more clearly now. Tall, unnaturally thin, with long, rigid limbs. It wasn't just looking at our window anymore. It was facing the back door, just standing there, waiting. My stomach twisted as I saw its head tilt, as if listening for something inside the house. And then, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The sound was real, not just on the camera. I heard it, echoing through the silent house. Emily clutched my arm, her body rigid with fear. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the knocks stopped. I checked the camera, barely able to hold the phone steady. The figure was gone. Just vanished. No movement, no retreating footsteps. It was just there 1 second and gone the next. We didn't sleep after that. The first thing I did in the morning was install more locks, more cameras, anything to make the house feel secure again. But the figure never came back. Not as far as we know. Maybe it lost interest. Maybe it moved on. Or maybe it's still out there, standing in someone else's backyard, staring at another open window, waiting to be noticed. When my brother and I moved into that house, we were just trying to survive. Rent was cheap, and at that point in our lives, cheap was all that mattered. I had just lost my job, and Eric, my younger brother, was barely making enough at the auto shop to cover groceries. The house itself was old, with peeling wallpaper and a weird, musty smell that never quite went away, but it had 4 walls and running water. We figured we'd fix it up a little, make it livable. The first few days were fine. We joked about how horror movie cliches start exactly like this. 2 broke guys moving into a sketchy house. But we weren't superstitious. We just needed a place to crash. It was maybe the 4th or 5th night when I first heard it. A faint scratching noise, coming from inside the walls. At first I thought it was the wind. Old houses creak, after all. But as I lay there in the dark, I realized it was rhythmic. Almost deliberate. Like someone running their fingernails along the drywall. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just mice. We'd seen a couple of roaches in the kitchen already, so a rodent problem wouldn't be a surprise. The next morning, I mentioned it to Eric, but he just laughed and said, "Welcome to budget housing." We shrugged it off and kept going about our routine. Him heading to work, me scouring job listings, both of us pretending the house wasn't getting under our skin. Then things got weirder. Small stuff at first. Food missing from the fridge. The TV turning on by itself in the middle of the night. One time I walked into the bathroom and saw the mirror completely fogged up, as if someone had just taken a hot shower. But Eric had been at work all day, and I hadn't used the bathroom since that morning. The strangest part was that the shower floor was dry. I even checked the pipes under the sink, thinking maybe there was a leak causing humidity buildup, but everything was normal. It was unsettling, but not enough to make me think we were in danger. I figured it was just paranoia, a side effect of stress and not getting enough sleep. Then, the thing with my bedroom door happened. I always lock my door at night. a habit I picked up from living in cheap apartments with thin walls. That night, I had checked twice before lying down, making sure the deadbolt was turned. But when I woke up, the door was open. Just a crack, but enough to make my stomach drop. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the gap. The hallway outside was dark, silent. I tried to convince myself Eric had needed something and didn't want to wake me. But when I asked him at breakfast, he swore up and down he hadn't touched my door. That's when we decided to set up a camera. We didn't have any fancy equipment, just an old webcam and my laptop. We set it up in the hallway, angled toward the bedroom doors and the laundry room at the end of the hall. That was the one spot in the house that gave me the creeps. The door to the laundry room was a little off its hinges, and inside there was this small crawl space that led under the house. The first time we saw it, Eric joked that someone could be living down there, but neither of us wanted to investigate too closely. We figured we'd check the footage in the morning, see if maybe the door had just drifted open from a draft or something simple like that. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound put me on edge. The tick of the pipes, the occasional groan of the wood settling. At some point, I swear I heard footsteps, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath, listening, but the house was silent again within seconds. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being ridiculous, but I still found myself gripping the baseball bat I kept next to my bed until the first hint of daylight crept through the blinds. The next morning, we pulled up the footage, expecting to find nothing. At first, everything looked normal, just the two of us going to our rooms, the hallway sitting empty for hours. But around 3:17 a.m., something moved. At the far end of the hall, the door to the laundry room shifted, just a tiny fraction. Then, slowly, it opened. And someone, stepped out. Eric cursed under his breath, leaning in closer to the screen. The figure was small, wiry, dressed in loose, dark clothing that blended into the shadows. Their face was obscured, just a blur of pale skin and dark hollows where their eyes should be. They moved unnaturally, stiff yet deliberate, stepping carefully down the hall. And then, they stopped, right outside my door. They stood there, motionless, just standing, for over an hour. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Eric was dead silent beside me, his hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. On the screen, the figure didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even breathe as far as we could tell. Just a pale shape in the dim glow of the hallway, standing right outside my door, watching. Then, at 4:28 a.m., as if some invisible signal had been given, the figure moved. Not like a normal person would. There was no hesitation, no adjusting of their weight, no sound. It was like a puppet being pulled by strings. They turned in one slow, jerky motion and glided back toward the laundry room. When they reached the crawl space, they crouched, their limbs folding awkwardly, and slipped inside without a second of hesitation. The door didn't even close properly behind them. They had been inside our house, living there, moving around at night, watching us. Eric shot up from his chair, pacing the tiny kitchen with his hands on his head. "We need to call the cops," he muttered, voice shaky. I just sat there staring at the frozen frame of the video, at that tiny crack in the laundry room door. "Dude," Eric said, stopping in front of me, "we need to do something. Now." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper. "What if they're still in there?" I finally whispered. The thought made my skin crawl. If we called the cops and they searched the crawl space, what would they find? A nest of stolen food? A sleeping bag? Worse? Eric didn't even hesitate. He grabbed the heaviest wrench he had from his toolbox and marched straight to the laundry room. I followed, every step feeling like I was walking towards something I didn't want to see. The air in that part of the house was stale, thick, carrying the faint scent of something sour, something human. My hands were shaking as Eric yanked the crawl space door open. The space beneath the house was pitch black. A wave of hot, stagnant air rolled out, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach turn. Sweat, mildew, and something faintly rotten. Eric aimed his flashlight inside, and we both held our breath. There was a nest of crumpled blankets shoved into the corner, along with an old pillow that looked like it had been stolen from one of our beds. Next to it, an open backpack sat filled with half-eaten food. Our food. Granola bars, slices of bread, even a can of soup with a rusty spoon still sticking out of it. But what made my skin crawl the most were the little things. A pile of nail clippings, tufts of hair tangled in a comb, and scattered across the floor, dozens of Polaroid photos. My hands shook as I picked one up. It was my bedroom door, taken from the hallway. Another showed the kitchen, empty and dark. Then one of Eric sleeping, his face barely illuminated by the glow of his alarm clock. The worst one was at the bottom of the pile. A photo of me, taken from inside my room. The angle was low, near the floor, like someone had been lying under my bed. I dropped it, my chest tightening with pure panic. Eric must have seen the same thing I did because he swore under his breath and turned toward me, his face pale. "We're getting the hell out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Neither of us wanted to stick around long enough to see if our uninvited guest was coming back. We grabbed the essentials, whatever we could fit into our bags in less than 5 minutes, and bolted. I didn't care about losing the deposit. I didn't care about leaving furniture behind. I just wanted to be gone. Eric called the cops once we were a few blocks away. By the time they arrived, the crawl space was empty. Whoever had been living in our walls had vanished. We never went back. Never found out who they were, how long they'd been there, or what they had planned. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that last photo, the one taken from inside my room, and I wonder if, while I was sleeping, they were watching me. I moved into the house on a Monday. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom rental in a quiet neighborhood, but it was cheap, and after years of living with roommates, I was more than ready to have a place of my own. The landlord, an older guy named Mr. Holloway, had barely given me a tour. He just handed me the keys, told me the last tenant left in a hurry, and muttered something about how the place had its quirks. At the time, I figured he meant the creaky floors or the water pressure, but looking back, I should have asked more questions. The first week was uneventful. I worked long hours at a coffee shop downtown, so I wasn't home much. When I was, I mostly spent my time unpacking, binge-watching old sitcoms, and enjoying the silence of living alone. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. No kids playing outside, no neighbors stopping by to introduce themselves. The only person I ever saw was the mailman, who barely acknowledged me when I waved. But honestly, I didn't mind. It was nice to have space, to feel like this house was truly mine. Then, little things started happening. The first time, I barely noticed. Just a nagging feeling that something was slightly off. I'd turn off the bathroom light before leaving for work, only to come home and find it on again. A chair at my kitchen table wasn't tucked in the way I remembered. My bedroom door, which I always left open a crack for airflow, would be shut when I woke up. Stupid, tiny things. Things that could be explained by absent-mindedness or exhaustion. I told myself I was just adjusting to a new space, that I was overthinking. But then, on Friday morning, I found my front door open. Not wide open, just barely ajar. An inch, maybe 2. The lock was still in place, the chain still latched. I stood there for a long time staring at it, my stomach twisting in knots. I tried to think logically. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way the night before. Maybe the latch hadn't caught. But I knew that wasn't right. I always double-checked the locks before bed. Always. That day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept picturing that door cracked open just enough for someone to slip inside. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I checked the locks 3 times before going to bed, pressing my weight against the door to make sure it was shut tight. I even wedged a chair under the handle just in case. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the unease didn't fade. I barely slept, waking up at every little sound, pipes settling, branches tapping against the window, my own breathing too loud in the silence. By Saturday morning, I knew I needed to do something to calm my nerves. I went out and bought a small security camera, the kind that connected to an app on my phone. I set it up in the hallway, facing my bedroom door. If anything weird happened, I'd have proof. Proof that I was either losing my mind or that something else was going on. That night, I made a point of filming myself locking the front door. I even spoke out loud to the camera, narrating every step. Lock is in place, chain is latched, door is closed. I fell asleep with the app open on my phone, the live feed showing nothing but an empty hallway. At 3:12 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. I didn't see the notification until the next morning. I had slept through it, which was strange. Normally, the smallest sound woke me up. My heart pounded as I opened the app and scrolled back to the footage. The first motion detection was just me, coming home from work. The second one at 3:12 a.m. was different. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as my bedroom door slowly creaked open. No one was there. No shadows, no figures, just the door, moving on its own. My stomach twisted, my hands cold and clammy. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it as a draft or a faulty hinge, I saw it. In the corner of the frame near the bottom of the door, a pair of hands. Pale fingers gripping the door frame. And then, as if sensing the camera, they slipped out of view. I froze. My mind went completely blank, like my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping I was imagining it. But every time, it was the same. The door opening, those hands gripping the frame, and then disappearing. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been standing outside my bedroom while I slept. The thought made me feel sick. I bolted up from the couch, checking every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. Every window was locked. The front door was still shut, the chain in place. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. But the footage didn't lie. I called the police. I didn't know what else to do. An officer showed up about 30 minutes later, a tired-looking guy named Officer Reynolds. He listened as I explained everything, about the lights, the moved objects, the open door, the footage. I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. Could be a glitch, he said, barely glancing at the video. Or maybe you left the door open yourself. When I insisted, he did a half-hearted sweep of the house, checking the locks, shining his flashlight into the attic crawl space. No signs of forced entry, he said with a shrug. If you're worried, maybe stay with a friend for a few nights. That was it. That was all he did. I couldn't stay there. Not after that. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's place across town. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, checking my phone constantly. The next morning I went back to grab more of my things, but the second I stepped inside, I knew I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, wrong. The hairs on my arms stood up. I inched toward my bedroom, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The closet door was open. I knew I had closed it before I left. My mouth went dry, and then I saw it. Something tucked into the crack between the door and the wall. A small crumpled piece of paper. I don't know why, but I hesitated before picking it up, my hands shaking. The note was written in messy, almost childlike handwriting. Just 4 words, scrawled in black ink. Why did you leave? I never went back. I broke my lease. told the landlord whatever he wanted to hear. I crashed on friends' couches until I found a new place, somewhere far away. To this day, I don't know who was in that house with me. I don't know how long they had been there or what they wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those hands, gripping the door frame, watching, waiting, and I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't left?